Welcome to this series of Bible studies prepared by Salvation Army women from around the world who strive to put their faith into practice. The theme of these studies is Transformed into God's Image. We believe that everyone who puts their faith in Jesus can be transformed. My name is Heidrun Edwards and I am from Germany. I would like to share with you the aids in this series of 12 studies. Each study includes 4 sections to help you explore and discover more on the theme. Under the heading Transformed in Our Suffering, these are my thoughts based on Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 8, verses 17 to 28. Our key verse is verse 17. Now, if we are children, then we are heirs, heirs of God, and co-heirs with Christ. If, indeed, we share in his sufferings, in order that we may also share in his glory. In Isaiah chapter 53, verses 2 to 4, Jesus is portrayed as suffering personified. He gives suffering a face. For this reason, for centuries, a crucifix could be found in hospital wards to indicate to the patients that they were not alone in their suffering. Throughout his earthly life, Jesus experienced suffering for various reasons, including rejection from his own people, the believers of his time, Matthew chapter 13, verses 53 to 58, lack of understanding from his family, Mark 3, verse 21, suffering because of compassion, John 11, verse 33. Persecution, John 5, verse 16. Illness and injury. Although the Bible does not explicitly mention these, Jesus must have experienced illness, and as carpenter, we might assume that sometimes he was injured. The Gospels report the unusual occurrences in Jesus' life, not the common ones. Jesus understands all the various suffering which mankind encounters. There's nothing he did not experience himself in one way or another. Jesus not only understands, but he also sets an example, Isaiah 53, verse 7, and gives advice, Matthew 5, verses 79 to 42. We live in a fallen world, a world marked by sin, Romans 3, verses 11 to 18. We live in a world that has an expiry date stamped on it. We just don't know the exact date, Revelation 21, verse 1. As Christians, we are not taken out of this world, John 17, verse 15. But, like Jesus who came from heaven to earth and lived among the people, we are called to continue to live among the people of this world. Ever since Adam and Eve left paradise, there has been suffering on the earth. Ecclesiastes 1, verse 9 says, "There's nothing new under the sun." Jesus willingly accepted suffering as part of his humanity. As his followers, we should not expect it to walk throughout life without experiencing suffering at different times. There are many types of suffering relating to all parts of our lives: body, mind, soul, emotions, and spirit. And there's no such thing as a scale that measures suffering from not so bad to worst. We should be careful not to judge our suffering against that of other people or devalue their suffering. The world we live in requires instant solutions. The expectation of immediately resolved suffering is very much present and can influence our thinking. Sometimes, I'm not sure why people want suffering to end. Is it because of the person, a family member perhaps, going through a time of suffering? Or is it because they themselves cannot cope with the situation? To identify the nature of our suffering is important, as it influences our praying. An immediate resolution is rare, and at times not possible. Perhaps we have to learn anew how to have staying power. The theme of suffering is not alien to me. Much of my officership has been spent in social institutions where injured people were cared for. I experienced a dark time in my soul, but I can testify that our Lord is greater. He wins the battle. Isaiah 31, verses 4-5. In times of suffering, one Bible verse has encouraged me over and over again. Romans 8, verse 28 states, "And we know, in all things, God works for good of those who love Him." This verse does not mean that as Christians we will only encounter good things, but that God can transform the bad things in our life, suffering, into something good for me and for others, if we allow Him to do so. Not always as easy as it might seem at first. Giving God permission means that He has the say in everything related to suffering. But it does not mean that suffering will definitely be taken away. Nor does it mean that suffering should be used for our own purposes, for example, to attract attention. Although we cannot avoid suffering, we should not actively seek it for the sake of it. Suffering reminds us that our life on earth is not for eternity. Something much better, more fantastic is yet to come. I'm convinced that the way Christians handle suffering is a much-needed testimony to our society where immaculate appearance, including mental as well as physical health, is applauded. Here are some questions for you to think about or discuss in a group. It is suggested that you pause to reflect after each question. Perhaps writing down your thoughts might be helpful. When you have considered all the questions, listen to the concluding statement, which will help you put into practice what you have heard. Question 1. How do you react to suffering? Question 2. Can you give examples of how suffering has been or can be transformed into something good? Question 3. Do I allow Jesus to transform my suffering into something good? During dark times of your life, hold up to God whatever you are facing and allow Him to transform it into something good. Let Him be the wings beneath your feet and the assurance for victory to come. I am currently working at the Salvation Army International Headquarters in London as Assistant Under-Secretary in the Europe Zone. I not only get a glimpse of the amount of suffering worldwide, refugees, natural disasters, persecution, but I also get to know what can happen when Christ's transforming power is claimed and absorbed. Our next study is about being transformed in our acts of social justice.